Hey everyone, welcome back to Yee's Law Journal. I'm your host Josh, and I'm here with Alice. Today's episode is a special one as we dive into the antitrust battles between Epic Games and two tech giants, Google and Apple. How's it going, Alice?
Hi Josh, I'm really looking forward to this one. Epic Games has really taken on the giants with their lawsuits, and it's fascinating to see how both cases, Epic vs Google Hi and Epic vs Apple, are unfolding differently.
Absolutely. So, grab yourself a cup of coffee or tea, and let's walk you through the details of these legal battles. And if you're out for a walk, just enjoy listening as we break down these complex cases into bite-sized bits of insight.
Exactly. So, Josh, let's start with Epic v Google, which is the more recent one. This case kicked off in 2020 when Epic accused Google of monopolizing the Android app distribution and payment systems through its Play Store. Epic's goal was clear. They wanted to break down Google's closed ecosystem and introduce more competition.
Right. Epic argued that Google's practices violated Sections 1 and 2 of the Sherman Act. Essentially, they said Google's behavior stifled competition and unfairly monopolized the market. This led to a long, drawn-out legal battle, and after months of litigation, the jury did indeed find that Google was engaging in anti-competitive behavior.
And what's particularly interesting about this case is that the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, stepped in with a friend of the court brief. The FTC really highlighted how digital markets are unique, especially with the network effects and data feedback loops that create huge barriers to entry for competitors. The FTC urged the court to take strong action to restore competition in the Android ecosystem, pointing out that Google's practices not only harmed developers, but also negatively affected consumers.
Exactly. And after all that back and forth, we saw the court hand down a more permanent injunction on October 7, 2024. This injunction requires Google to make some major changes to its Play Store and its business practices. Let's break down some of the key points for our listeners.
Sure. First off, the court is forcing Google to allow third-party app stores to install on the Play Store itself. This means users will be able to download and use other app stores right from Google Play, which is huge for competition in the Android app distribution space.
Yeah, and on top of that, Google has to allow developers to use their own payment systems for in-app purchases. This is a major shift because up until now, developers were forced to use Google Play billing, which meant paying a cut of their revenue to Google.
And then there's the anti-steering clause. This is where Google used to prevent developers from telling users about alternative ways to download apps or make payments. Under the new injunction, that's no longer allowed. Developers can now tell users about cheaper or more flexible payment options outside of the Play Store.
This injunction is pretty significant, right? It's asking Google to fundamentally change the way they operate their Android ecosystem within 3 years. It affects millions of consumers and developers who've been locked into Google's closed system for years.
It's definitely a game changer. But as expected, Google didn't just take this sitting down. They've filed an appeal and requested a stay on the injunction. They're arguing that implementing these changes in such a short time frame is too complex. Josh, you remember the arguments they put forward?
Oh, absolutely. Google says that the injunction requires massive technical changes to the Play Store, and that could potentially affect user privacy and security. They also believe the court overstepped its legal authority with such a broad ruling. Google is claiming that if this injunction takes effect immediately, it will cause irreparable harm to their business and could lead to chaos for millions of users and developers.
Yeah, Google definitely doesn't want this injunction to go into effect right away. They've asked the court to pause it until their appeal can be heard. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming months.
Totally. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about Epic's lawsuit against Apple, which went through the courts a little earlier. There are some similarities between the two cases, but the outcomes are quite different.
Yeah, in Epic v Apple. Epic also challenged Apple's App Store policies, arguing that Apple had a monopoly over the distribution of iOS apps and in-app payments. However, the court's 2021 ruling was more favorable to Apple compared to what we're seeing now with Google.
Right. In Apple's case, the court didn't find Apple guilty of violating federal antitrust laws. The court essentially ruled that Apple's control over its iOS ecosystem, what we call the walled garden approach, was a legitimate business practice. Apple emphasized security and privacy in their defense, and the court largely agreed with that reasoning.
But Apple didn't get away completely unscathed. The court did rule that Apple's practice of preventing developers from telling users about external payment options violated California's unfair competition law. So, Apple was ordered to allow developers to communicate alternative payment methods, but that's it, no major changes to the App Store's structure.
So, while Epic did win a small victory in terms of payment transparency, Apple kept most of its control over the App Store intact. But when we compare that to the Google case, the ruling is a lot more disruptive for Google.
Exactly. The court in Epic versus Google is asking for a complete overhaul of the Android platform, particularly with how apps are distributed and how payments are processed. Whereas Apple was allowed to maintain control over its ecosystem, Google is being forced to open up its entire platform to competition.
And the legal reasoning was pretty different too. In Apple's case, the court accepted that Apple's closed ecosystem was part of its business model, with a focus on security and privacy. But in Google's case, the court focused more on the anti-competitive nature of Google's control over the Android platform. The court was much more concerned about the lack of competition and the harm to both developers and consumers.
Yeah, that's the big difference here. Apple's case didn't really challenge the core of its business model. Meanwhile, the Google ruling is essentially saying, you need to fundamentally change how you run your Android ecosystem.
Exactly. So, to sum it up, both cases involved App Store monopolies and payment system restrictions, but the outcomes are pretty different. Apple came away with relatively minor changes, while Google is being forced to make some massive adjustments, assuming the injunction stands.
And it's worth keeping an eye on Google's appeal. If the court grants their request to stay the injunction or overturns it entirely, it could change the whole landscape of how tech platforms are regulated moving forward.
No doubt. These cases are setting new precedents for how antitrust laws are applied to digital platforms, and they're reshaping the way we think about competition in the tech world.
Agreed, and it's not just Google and Apple. These rulings are going to have ripple effects across the entire digital economy. We're looking at a whole new era for platform competition.
Absolutely. All right, that's a wrap for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these cases.
Yeah, thanks for listening. And remember, you can follow us on social media or subscribe to my channel, Coffee Chat at YouTube, for more updates on legal trends. See you next time.
Bye, everyone!
Bye.